Hey everyone, Dodge here for Team Chaos MTG with Isamaru, hanging out and uh, going to be going over another deck tech for Standard, which has been new Standard for, I want to say we're in week 3 now, going into week 4 after the weekend. And myself, I know I did the deck tech on Wizards. That deck proved to be a bit fragile, definitely far too fragile to hang with the likes of the Is It Spells and Golgari decks. And so we've made the shift to Jeskai Control. Uh, Pretty popular deck right now. Let's go ahead and take a look at the core of that. Every control deck needs to draw cards, and we have a fairly critical mass of cards that are letting us do that. 4 Chemist's Insight, 2 Opt, and 2 Search for Azcanta. Now, as much as the deck does have a risk of milling itself out, there is an argument to be said for changing to 3 Opt and 3 Insights, which is something I'll probably be doing going into the PPTQ this weekend. Next up, our counter suite. 3 Syncopate, 4 Ionize, and 4 Sinister Sabotage. Sorry about the jerking around. The dog is over here with a frog, and she is having way too much fun with it. So the counter suite is pretty standard. 10 counter spells, 11 counter spells in the main. Hitting all targets, nothing situational like Essence, Scatter, or Negate in the main. You could probably change the Syncopates or some number of Sabotage for those if you think your meta is going to be dependent on those type of spells. I'm happy keeping the Syncopates in the main. Giving ourselves a turn 2 counter spell is always good, and being able to exile key cards from decks that want to bring back Phoenixes of one type or another, or that might be trying to jumpstart cards. Just getting those out of the graveyard, making sure the opponent doesn't have a chance to recur them is good, and more matchups than I think a lot of people would consider. Into the removal spells, 2 Cleansing Nova, 3 Deafening Clarion, a Banefire, and an Ixalan's Binding. Now the Banefire is obviously going to be for the matches that go a bit longer, the control mirrors, things like that. The Cleansing Novas and Deafening Clarions are good just about anywhere. Less so in the control mirrors, but we're not too worried about having dead cards in that matchup, as these are just things that we can pitch to our jumpstart cards, like our Chemist's Insight. Ixalan's Binding has proven to be really instrumental in certain matchups, especially against the big mono red decks, the Golgari matchups, and to a lesser extent the control mirrors. Once we get rid of a Teferi in game 1, if they can't do something about our binding, they're never going to be able to beat us in that match. Next up, we are looking at the things that make our deck really scary. That is 3 Teferis and 4 mission briefings. Now, I shouldn't have to say too much about Teferi. He does it all. He wins games by himself. If you get that emblem down, you're basically never going to lose. Mission briefing, I did another video about a few weeks ago. It's a Snapcaster Mage that fuels itself. Maybe it's not as good as Snapcaster in Modern or Legacy, but for the purposes of Standard, just having access to a card that powerful, whatever form it comes in, is going to do so much work, and it has done a lot of work for me. Getting to recast your board sweepers, Deafening Clarion, basically getting Jumpstart through this card for an additional 2 mana, and again, it fueling itself. I've had some games that I won just by finding what I needed in the top 2 cards, even though there wasn't a copy of it in our graveyard. Being able to bin something like that before we recast it, it's insanely powerful. And let's go ahead and move on here to Expansion Explosion. I'm only running one of this. I know a lot of people have been harping on this card pretty heavily, especially in the first couple of weeks of the format. I have found it to be a bit underwhelming. If you can get off Explosion for lethal, that's great, but you do also run a risk of decking yourself by the time that you're able to do that. Expansion is phenomenal in the mirrors, being able to copy your opponent's counterspell, even in the mid-range decks, being able to copy something like a Vraska's Contempt or an Assassin's Trophy is really powerful, but I don't know that it's actually what we're trying to do consistently, so I am just running the one copy of it. Dream Eater, another one of in the deck. This thing is stupid good. Surveil 4 and bouncing something definitely makes up for the fact that it's only a 4/3. Flash makes it playable at that cost for 6 mana. The card's just a beater. I won't say that it closes out too many games, but it does provide you an edge that control decks really haven't had in a while. I want to say, personally, I want to say that this is almost as good as something like a Pearl Lake Ancient, and it really is proving itself to be invaluable. The lands here, we don't have perfect mana. Steam Vents, Glacial Fortress, a single Field of Ruin, just because there aren't that many opposing lands that we're really trying to blow up. But something like a flipped Search for Azcanta or a flipped Legion's Landing, those cards are problematic for us, and we do want a way to get rid of them. This is also pretty good, just blowing up an opponent's shock land so that we can filter our mana. Memorial to Genius I have since replaced with Arch of Vraska. That's a land that produces colorless mana. If you have 10 or more permanents, you get the City's Blessing, and once you get to that point, 5 mana and tapping it to draw a single card is maybe on the surface not as powerful as Memorial to Genius, but instead of 2 cards, you get to draw 1 card over and over and over again. There's no sacrifice effect to the land, and it's just proven itself, at least to me, to be a better card in this matchup, especially when you do also have backup from things like Search for Azcanta. They're going to let you draw cards through cheaper activations. Going ahead into the rest of our lands, 3 Clifftop Retreats, 3 Sulphur Falls, and 3 Sacred Foundries. Now, once we have Hallowed Fountain in the format, this mana base is going to change a whole lot. It's going to be much more consistent. That said, I actually haven't had too many issues with consistency this way. The deck is usually pretty good as long as you have a Deafening Clarion or another red-white spell in hand early. It doesn't really matter if you get cut off of blue, and you shouldn't have a problem with that with so many blue sources in the main. Going on to our basic lands, it's a 3-2-1 split. The only time you're really going to need that mountain is when your opponent's cutting you off of your other colors, you're having bad draws, you just need something for Ionize or Banefire. The blue sources and the white sources in the numbers they are, that's kind of obvious. Those are the colors that the deck is primarily leaning into. Moving on to the sideboard, a couple of negates and Essence Scatters backed up by 1 Disdainful Stroke makes up the additional counter magic. Another Ixalan's Binding to come in against those mid-range or big mono red decks. Shutting the opponent off of things like Sarkhan can win a game by itself, especially if they're hurting for lands. And he's one of those cards that allows those decks to operate with a bad starting hand. As long as they can continue moving the game forward with Sarkhan, they're doing pretty well, getting those 5 and 6 mana dragons out early. If we can shut them off of that, we're super happy. And if we can hit a Chain Whirler with this thing, we're pretty much just good to go for the rest of the match. More board sweepers, Deafening Clarion, Settle the Wreckage. River's Rebuke I have recently changed out for another Cleansing Nova. As good as it is against the token decks, the ability to wipe any artifacts and enchantments, especially in the mirror match if your opponent starts bringing in things like their own Ixalan's Binding, or against the Selesnya decks where the opponent's playing a lot of small creatures, a lot of Convoke stuff. That extra mana on the cost of River's Rebuke is pretty painful. Having a 5-mana sweeper that can deal with creatures or can be recurred with a mission briefing later to deal with opposing enchantments, I just think it's a bit better. I'm not discounting River's Rebuke as a card in Standard. I just don't think right now is the best time for it as far as its position in the format goes. 2 Lava Coils and 2 Sorceress Spyglass. Uh, any way you can have to deal with things like a Nicol Bolas if it's going to get resolved. Vraska's. Obviously, Sorcerer's Spyglass is a bit sketchy to bring in the mirror. I tried to avoid it there because if we name Teferi, if we name Search for Azcanta, or I can't remember the flipped side of it, but the other side of Search for Azcanta, you're going to have a bad time. You're not going to be able to activate your own copy. Now, some of those decks do bring in Karn, and that is something that we might want to name here, but unless we see it in Game 2, I don't think we're really bringing that in until Game 3. Now, here is one of my absolute favorite cards. I can't believe this thing isn't really flying on top of the radar right now because it just locks out so many matchups for you. Dawn of Hope, getting you those 1/1 lifelinkers, letting you draw extra cards just for attacking or blocking with them, being able to ensure that a mono red deck is effectively never going to be able to kill you. It's a great feeling. I've had as many as 7 or 8 tokens on the field at a time, and at that point there is actually nothing that your opponent can do about it. I will say that this card is a bit situational. If you draw it late, you're happier than you are if you draw it early, especially because you're typically still digging for your board wipes. You want to make sure that you can stabilize before you start playing out a bunch of 1/1s for 4 mana apiece. I think that's about it for today. I'm looking forward to the PPTQ. I've made some changes to this deck. We might get a follow-up video on that later this week, but I thought I'd give you guys the rundown on what Jeskai Control is trying to do and how it's doing it, the numbers of everything in the deck. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Like, share, subscribe, do all the things that let people know that you're watching us and that we exist. And I will see you guys next time here at Team Chaos MTG on YouTube.